Welcome to everyone to this version of Transatlantic Currents, where we will be talking about Indo-Pacific, great power competition, China, US, European and US perspectives. Now, the Transatlantic Currents webinar is run by two of FIIA's former visiting fellows. So Deborah McCarthy will be running today and Leo Michel. Thank you for them. My name is Charly Salonius-Pasternak, and for those who can see in detail, I am sitting in a train, so apologies in advance if I break up. I have been talking to a high school in Western Finland. I run the Center on U.S. Politics and Power at the Institute. And as always, I'm going to start by thanking first the ERCO Foundation for having supported the center for a number of years now, including making the visiting fellows possible. And I want to thank Mayu, Kirsi, and the rest of the FIIA staff for making these events possible. And finally, I'd like to thank Deborah for hosting today. Now, for those of you who don't know, Deborah has been the ambassador for the US and Lithuania 2013, 2016. I can hardly imagine a more exciting and time to be there. But also deputy ambassador in Greece. And her career has spanned both economic affairs, kind of harder diplomacy, security, cybercrime most recently. So I really can't think of a better person to lead the discussion on this region where all of these are issues. And as a final plug before I hand it over to Deborah, I'd like to highlight a podcast series. I know everyone has lots to listen to, but the General and the Ambassador series, which I think now is in number 67 or so.
80.
80 is definitely worth a listen. We will put a link into the chat for anyone who's not familiar with that. And before that, please write your questions into the chat, and I will be looking at the second half of our seminar. Deborah, take it away.
Thank you, Charlie, and thanks to the FIIA team for pulling together another one of our webinars. It's a great pleasure today to be joined by Matt Goodman, the Vice President for Economics at the Center for International and Strategic Studies in Washington, D.C., where he holds the Simon Chair in Political Economy. Matt and I served together at the State Department a number of years ago when he was senior advisor to the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs during the Obama administration. He then went on over to the White House, joining the National Security Staff as a Director for International Economics, helping the President prepare for global and regional summits, including the G20, APEC, and the East Asia Summit. His previous positions also include being Managing Director for Asia at the Albright Stonebridge Group and Director for Asian Economic Affairs at the White House. So welcome, Matt, and thank you so much for joining us soon after you've returned from a trip, I understand.
Yes, that's right. Thanks, Deborah. Nice to be here.
Well, I thought we'd start for our group today talking a little bit about the recent G7 meeting in Japan. I note that on the economic agenda, the final communique called for supporting a free, open, and fair economic order, and also for enhancing economic security, amongst other goals. The G7 leaders also noted they will address China's distortive non-market policies and practices and foster resilience to economic coercion. In a separate foreign minister's statement, there was also outlined a long list of concerns with China's economic practices. So, Matt, with your experience and knowledge of the region, what do you think was achieved in the G7 in terms of pushing back on China's efforts to challenge the existing order and exert its influence not only in the Indo-Pacific but beyond in the global South?
Sure. Well, I mean, as always, these G7 meetings cover a lot of ground, and I'd say that definitely Ukraine was issue number 1, 2, and 3 on the agenda for leaders, and particularly with President Zelensky's surprise visit to Hiroshima. I think that really encapsulated how important that issue was for the G7 plus countries. But China did get notice, and unusually, I mean, I not only read communiques, which is not something I would recommend to everyone. But if you have the interest in reading, I think it was 65 paragraphs of text. You will find that in paragraph 51, there is an explicit mention of China, which is unusual in itself to mention one country other than, sort of traditional bad actors like North Korea and so forth. But it was a sort of list of bullets, I think 9 bulleted points about China, some of which was to reassure China that, or try to reassure China that we weren't trying to set China back or stifle their development or growth, that we wanted to engage with them, had to engage with them on a number of issues like climate change and pandemic health issues and so forth. But that we also had some real concerns about China's actions and behavior, ranging from its non-market practices to its activities in the East and South China Seas, to its economic coercion. And that's something I think we're going to talk a little bit more about. But it was a pretty, I'd say sharp, straight up statement. I'd say, just one final point. I would say overall, and since this is a transatlantic context here, I'd say what has struck me, and this was further validation of it, is that Europe is moving a little towards the U.S. on substance, and the U.S. is moving a little towards Europe on tone. So I think that paragraph 51, in a way, reflected that the U.S. was a little softer in its tone, but the sharp edge is still there.
Well, as you mentioned and noted in this context, China does use economic coercion as a tool of economic statecraft. And at CSIS, you and Matt Reynolds co-authored a fascinating report, and I read through almost all of it to prepare, called Deny, Deflect, Deter, Countering China's Economic Coercion, where you analyzed 8 cases where China has used economic coercion, including against Norway in 2010, after the Nobel Prize was awarded to Chinese dissident Liu Xiaobo, and in 2021 against Lithuania, after Lithuania allowed Taiwan to open an office using the name Taiwan, not Taipei, in Vilnius. So my question is, what were the patterns across the 2 European cases in terms of what triggered it, the costs, and the effectiveness of China's attempt to use coercive measures?
Well, thanks. Yeah, thanks for the plug of our report. It was a labor of love. We spent about 16 months really diving pretty deep, first of all, into kind of traditional deterrence literature and game theory and things that I had not read since graduate school. So it was actually a good exercise in refreshing my sort of theoretical knowledge here. But then we dived into 8 case studies, as you said, including the Norway and Lithuania cases. And then sort of drew some conclusions and findings, and then a recommended counter strategy, which I'll talk about. But since you asked about those 2 cases, Norway and Lithuania, I think they were actually very sort of model cases in effect of how China does this coercion. First of all, triggered in each case by a perceived offense to China's own interests. So in the Norway case, it was that that the Norwegian Nobel Committee had given the prize and had explicitly linked the prize to this dissidents' human rights activity in China. That's a no-no for Beijing. And in the Lithuania case, to use one Chinese character, that is the 2 characters for Taiwan, on a door of an office of a representative office. A lot of countries have Taipei representative offices, but a Taiwan representative office was again not something that Beijing tolerates. It feels offended by that. So these were pretty typical triggers. The response by China to those incidents, a mix of diplomatic expressions of unhappiness, diplomatic pressure in the case of the Norwegian case on 19 countries not to show up to the Nobel Prize ceremonies, and recall of ambassadors in, I think, both cases, suspension of certain dialogues and trade talks. And then, and this is the central thing that we found in most of these cases, a use of China's market power as a buyer of products and services from those countries. In the case of Norway, cutting off Norway's salmon exports to China. I think at one point, Norwegian salmon represented something like 90% of Chinese consumption, and it dropped to 2% or something in the next year or two. Only started to be restored in 2016, 17. So this went on for 6 or 7 years. In the case of Lithuania, not as much trade there actually to start with, but whatever trade there was cut off largely because China suddenly dropped the name of Lithuania from the sort of pull down list of countries in their customs entry procedures. So there was no Lithuania. So if a product came in from Lithuania, it didn't exist. And so it was blocked. So effectively there was an embargo and some other things they did to cause a little low-level economic pain on Lithuania. So fairly typical of the way China does this. That is, it is triggered by some sort of perceived offense. The economic coercion is fairly low level. It's targeted at an industry or a sector or a company in some cases that has particular economic interests in China, where there's an asymmetric advantage for China because they have, for example, in the Norwegian salmon case, there's such a large share of Norway's exports, and in which they can sort of have plausible deniability. In the Norwegian case, I guess I didn't say that ostensibly China said these were phytosanitary reasons. There was some health concern around Norwegian salmon, which suddenly appeared right after the Nobel ceremony. So that's all fairly typical, and I mean, we can talk about the aftermath and the responses to that, but that's sort of what happened, and why we thought it was particularly interesting and useful as a kind of case study of how China behaves in these cases.
Well, Matt, before we talk a little bit about how the U.S. and the EU have been working to address the challenges of, it's China's use of certain tools of economic statecraft, I wanted to ask you to help us understand better the current Biden administration's approach to managing competition with China. I note that in a recent speech, his national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, in a major speech on economic policy, said that the U.S. was not looking for confrontation or conflict, but was seeking to manage competition with China responsibly and to engage with China where it could. So what's your sense of the main elements of the administration's economic strategy vis-a-vis China?
Well, yes. Excuse me. Yes, National Security Advisor Sullivan's speech in late April was the latest of a series of speeches going back to Secretary of State Blinken last year, in which the sort of broad themes in U.S.-China strategy have been laid out. Secretary Raimondo of the Commerce Department did one in late November last year. Secretary Yellen did one a few weeks before the National Security Advisor. And they all are trying to strike that balance. In the original Blinken speech, which has now been sort of echoed in these other speeches, the U.S. identified sort of the Biden administration, three themes, three C's that would sort of guide U.S. Strategy towards China, which were competition, confrontation, and cooperation. So we would, and I think he used a nice turn of phrase, something like, we will compete where we should, we will confront where we must, and we will cooperate where we can, and something like that. I can't remember the verbs, but it was something like that. And I think that still was echoed in Jake Sullivan's speech in late April, that the U.S. is trying to strike this balance of recognizing that we have a deep engagement with China already. Economically, we have, hundreds of billions of dollars of bilateral trade. We have a stock of, hundreds of billions of dollars of investment in China, and vice versa. There's not as large, but a significant investment presence in the U.S. And and we've got to recognize that, first of all. Second of all, and that we're not going to sort of fully, and this is where Jake went a little further than others, echoing Ursula von der Leyen's speech, in which she talked about not decoupling but de-risking, reducing the risks in our economic engagement, and not trying to fully decouple. But the other reason we have to engage with China is obviously some of the global challenges that we all face. Again, climate change, pandemics, debt in the global South, and other issues are, we can't resolve those issues or even start to address them without China being in the room. And so those are the strong impulses to engage. And I think the U.S. was on track to do more engagement last fall after President Biden and President Xi met in Bali. But unfortunately, this balloon incident kind of blew things up, no pun intended. And so we got off track, and they're trying to get back on track. But then, to make no bones about the fact that we have a lot of areas in which we are in a strategic competition with China, and obviously a lot of those center around technology and critical technologies like semiconductors or quantum computing and biotechnology and other industries of the future. So it's a pretty sharp-edged competition, and then confronting China where it does things that are disruptive to the global order, including, as I say, militarizing islands in international waters, or coercing our allies and partners. And so they're trying to strike that balance. And I would just say everybody's trying to strike that balance, right? Europe is trying to strike that balance. I'm sure Finland itself is trying to strike that balance. Asian countries around China, we're all struggling with the same balance. And it's a question of where we come out on that spectrum of competition, confrontation, cooperation. So it's not that unusual in its broad thrust, the policy. It's just the specific choices and where you land on those 3 C's is what I think distinguishes the U.S. or the Biden administration approach here.
Well, and a related question, in going back to your report, the U.S. also uses a number of tools of economic statecraft, including coercive measures. But as you note in the report, there's a difference between the U.S. use of coercive measures and, for example, China's use. If you could comment a little bit on that.
Yeah. No, we do have a box in our report in which we talk about those differences. And, obviously the U.S. does use coercion. We had a public rollout of our report, and there was a State Department official on the panel. When I said, the U.S. coerces, she felt the need to say, no, we don't. We do, but we do it in a way that is very different from China. First of all, we do it transparently. We do it on the basis of laws and rules. We have processes of appeal. I mean, if you're targeted by sanctions, you can actually appeal that, unlike the Norwegian salmon exporters. And also importantly, our sanctions and our coercive activities are aimed at sort of broader or universal even challenges like human rights violations or proliferation of nuclear weapons, or preemptive invasions, illegal and unjustified and brutal invasions of neighboring countries. I mean, those are sort of broader problems. China's are, as I indicated in the Norway and Lithuania case, very specific, narrow concerns of China, obviously very important to them, but not really to the rest of the world. And so, that's a huge difference in itself. But it's mainly the transparency, the rule of law, and as opposed to China's informal, kind of deniable approach to coercion.
Well, I want to turn now to the dynamics between Europe and the United States on China. We have a number of fora where China is discussed, and obviously bilaterally, multilaterally. We have the US-EU dialogue on China. We have the US-EU Trade and Technology Council, which encompasses issues related to China. So we agree on some of the challenges, but the tactics of engaging with China are different. We've had visits at very high level from European heads of state and others. And in the case, for example, of President Macron, he brought a whole business delegation. So I wanted to ask you, Matt, from your perspective, what are the major differences between the perspectives on China's economic policies?
Yeah, I mean, as you indicated, I think the differences are not so much in the analysis of the problems. I mean, I think the European Commission certainly, and I think individual member states that are sort of focused on this, which most are, acknowledge that China is engaging in economic policies that are really problematic for us, whether it's massive industrial subsidies or forced technology transfer or intellectual property violations and even theft, and this economic coercion, and now tightening of information controls. And more broadly, the Communist Party's greater control of the market in China move away from reform and opening, which is, by the way, in and of itself, a problem for us, because we need a China that is reforming and opening and growing. And if it's not doing those things, that's a problem for us, just in terms of the impact on global growth, let alone our commercial interests in China and so forth. So I think there are a number of things that we share concerns about. And then it comes down to, but we all have tremendous economic stakes with China, as I mentioned. And so, we have differences about where we think the priority problems are and where we ought to be targeting our tools of economic statecraft to respond to these problems in China. And, the only thing I'd say is that we were very far apart, US and Europe, on these issues, 5, certainly 7 years ago. I think there's been a dramatic closing of the ranks, not just on the analysis of the problem, but in terms of, the responses. So, for example, on Huawei, this telecommunications company, there was a lot of resistance in Europe to the notion of disempowering or even stripping Huawei out of the telecom networks. There's still resistance to that, and Huawei still exists in Europe, but I think there's much more acceptance in Europe that this particular company does pose a particular set of risks and even threats. So, or on on advanced semiconductors, the Netherlands has now gone along with the U.S. policy, maybe reluctantly, but I think they understand the Dutch government understands the risk to them. If they sell these really high-end machine tools that help produce these really advanced semiconductors that could be used in military applications that redound back on us in NATO countries. So I think there's much more alignment than there was a few years ago, and really from here in Washington, it looks like in some ways the scales have fallen from the eyes of a lot of Europeans who were maybe a little bit optimistic, let's say, about the opportunities and not as focused on some of the risks. But we're still Mars and you're still Venus, as it were, to the European audience here. I'd say our sensibilities are still a little different on these issues. We're much more, I think, focused still on kind of national security versus maybe even economic security, which is not a term that it's starting to catch on here, but it isn't quite as robust a term here yet. So there are differences, and that's why we need those forums like the Trade and Technology Council and the others that you mentioned that help to try and bring those perspectives together.
Well, I wanted to turn, before we open it up to questions, to talk a little bit about the mechanisms used to respond to China's coercive behavior. I know that the EU has proposed the anti-coercive instrument, which would authorize the Commission to retaliate against any country that uses coercive measures. It's still being finalized. And then we have, during the G7, it was a platform was launched called the Coordination Platform on Economic Coercion. And then in a related move, the G7 also issued its first ever statement on economic security and resilience, tied to some extent to this issue. In your report, Matt, you recommend as a response strategy, a strategy of resilience and relief rather than retaliation. Can you explain why?
Sure. No, I think that the G7 developments are very interesting and sort of align largely with our recommended approach, with an important distinction that I'll come back to. But look, we looked at this and we went into this study thinking that China was bullying our friends and partners, and we needed to kind of punch back. That was our kind of approach to this, or attitude, and we came out of it just increasingly not convinced that retaliation was the right answer, or tit for tat retaliation. Certainly China's behavior is disruptive, it's divisive, it should be deterred. It's not good for the international system, but it is fairly low level. The macroeconomic cost on the countries coerced is not huge. In the case of Norway, for example, I didn't say this, but although Norwegian direct exports of salmon to China dropped from, as I said, something like 90% to 2%, actually Norwegian salmon exports increased 17-fold in like the 3-year period after that to Vietnam. And unless you believe that suddenly Vietnamese people developed a sudden taste for Norwegian salmon on that scale, you got to believe there was some trade diversion going on here, and that, in fact, Norway was still selling salmon to China, just doing it through Vietnam. So the actual economic impact, even on the salmon sector in Norway, let alone on the broader Norwegian economy, was pretty small. So against that backdrop, we said, okay, so if the U.S., and it really has to be the U.S. that takes the lead on this, and we can talk about that, but if others join, that's great. But I think certainly from here in Washington, we think the U.S. has to take the lead here. If the U.S. retaliates at a proportional level, it's probably not going to change China's calculations if it's that low. But if we escalate, and here's where deterrence theory came into play, if we escalate, we lose credibility, because frankly, I'm not sure I, as an American taxpayer, want to spend a lot of cost to us to support, much as I love Norway and I love Norwegian salmon, to go, to bat for Norwegian salmon. There's a limit to how much credibly the U.S. can say we're going to retaliate. It's not like nuclear war, where, famously de Gaulle asked Kennedy, would you trade New York for Paris? Even there, some doubts about our credibility. But if you say, would we trade, American salmon or American Cabernet Sauvignon for Australian Shiraz, I think Americans would be pretty dubious about that proposition. And so there's a credibility problem with retaliation. Final point about the problem with retaliation is that our partners don't want it. I mean, every one of the countries we talked to said, we don't really want the U.S. to retaliate, because if the U.S. retaliates and then goes away, it's like when the bully punches the little kid on the playground and the good kid comes up and punches the bully back, but then leaves the playground. It's the little kid who's going to be picked on by the bully. And so I think that we heard pretty unanimously that our partners don't really want retaliation. What they want, and that leads to where we came out, what they want is help becoming less vulnerable to this coercion, which is what leads to our recommendation of resilience strategies, meaning things like helping countries strengthen their supply chains, assess their vulnerabilities, engage in alternative trade patterns. And we strongly recommend the U.S. be more engaged in traditional trade negotiations. I mean, modified, but trade negotiations, to give countries alternative markets. So that's sort of your resilience part. And then the other thing is, if coerced, what our partners want from us is some relief. And relief could be defined as simply a statement of support. In the case of the Korea THAAD missile system, the Koreans are still sore, and I was there last week, are still sore about the fact the U.S. didn't say anything about that incident publicly. So even a statement of condemnation of China and support for our ally is valued. Then we could support a country in a WTO case, as we've done in the case of the Lithuania situation. Or we also recommend a small compensation fund, not a large one. You don't want to create moral hazard, but and there's some practical implementation problems, but create a small compensation fund to help the victims, the countries that are targeted, and make the good for their companies that are affected here. So we think that combination of resilience and relief is more credible, more effective. And just one final thing about how it ties back to the literature, if folks on the line are interested in that. There are two ways to deter somebody from doing something you don't want them to do. One is to threaten them with punishment, and the other is to threaten them with the risk of failure, make them think they're going to fail in their designs, right? And so what we found was punishment, not so much, but making China feel it's not going to work if we're united, if we're more resilient, if the U.S. and other G7 partners are willing to provide some relief and support, that's more likely over time to convince Beijing that this isn't going to work. By the way, it's not working very well for them. In most of the cases we looked at, even the tactical advantage that they were seeking. I mean, Lithuania still has that sign on the door in Vilnius called the Taiwanese Representative Office. There hasn't been. Norway didn't concede very much to China. So even the tactical advantage China is trying to gain doesn't really work very well. And strategically, it's been, you could argue, catastrophic for China. It's pushed, as I mentioned, Europe towards us. It's pushed Canada towards us. Canada stripped out Huawei. Australia joined the AUKUS agreement with the UK and US. I think there's a direct line from the coercion of Australia to that decision. So this isn't working well for Beijing, and so we want to reinforce that sense that they're paying a cost for this coercion.
Well, thank you, Matt. And I want to open it up to the audience if we have some questions in the queue. If not, I can jump in with more.
Sure. So far, I think this has been brilliant. Thank you. And I've taken furiously. I've been taking notes. So Deborah, take it away.
Sure. So you want me to ask a question, or should we taking one from the chat?
No, there are no questions in the chat
Okay.
at the moment. I'll start pestering the audience. Take it away. Yeah.
No problem. No problem. You mentioned, Matt, about the change in vocabulary. The term decoupling is being set aside in policy circles in favor of the terms de-risking and diversifying. What do you think is the significance of this change in vocabulary? Is it semantics or is it significant?
I think it is both. It's semantically significant because I think the White House here is worried about the tone of our approach sounding rough on the ears of our partners and allies. I think there's been a lot of feedback that they've received in the White House, and also on Beijing, because in the end, I think there is a recognition in the White House that we need to engage, as I mentioned, with China. But this is also substantive. I think that there is a greater understanding here that loose talk about decoupling is not realistic. I mean, we're not going to decouple with China. I mean, I don't know where you're sitting, anywhere you're sitting, look around. Everything you're looking at has a China nexus. I mean, virtually, right? It's made in China or assembled in China or has China's content in it. So you want that to go away? where's it going to be replaced, by, immediately or even over time? It's not realistic to think we're not going to depend on China for on that side of the ledger. And then you got 1.4 billion people in China, increasingly affluent, who are wanting to buy our stuff. And, it's not realistic to think that we're not going to need that market as well. So not to mention then the other things we need to talk to China about, and climate change and pandemics and so forth. So I just think they both, there's a recognition here that we can't decouple, we shouldn't decouple. The cost of that would be enormous, but also to try to signal to, Beijing and to our partners that we're not crazy, and we're not trying to fully disentangle our economies, let alone head down a path to conflict.
Well, at one point we had, and I participated in it a couple of times, the security and economic dialogue with China that went on. It sort of died under the Trump administration. So right now it appears we're looking to engage where we can, with different visits taking place. I know there'll be a visit of China in the U.S. soon, and we'll see whether the Secretary Blinken and others travel to China. But what do you think of the mechanism that was used in the past to go across a number of agencies and engage, in some cases, deeply with all counterparts in China? Yeah,
well, you're talking about the strategic and economic dialogue that the Obama administration pursued, and before that, the Bush 43 administration had something called the strategic economic dialogue, without the and or the ampersand in the middle, and that was a broad-based dialogue on a wide range of economic and strategic issues with China, led at the very high sort of vice premier level in China, and at the senior cabinet level here in the U.S. And that was useful for its time, and beneath the high level parts of that, there was a lot of useful interaction of bureaucrats and folks working on some of the detailed day-to-day issues. But it did become, by the end of the Obama administration, kind of a carnival. I mean, there were too many people, too many agencies, too many issues, too much press attention. And so it was kind of probably reaching the end of its useful life. But obviously the Trump administration had a different approach to these things anyway, so it did get killed off. There isn't much appetite here for reestablishing something as broad and articulated as that, but there is definitely a strong impulse to engage. And as you said, there is a series of cabinet officers here who are planning to go to China when the time is right. Secretary Yellen, the Treasury Secretary, said in her speech that she intends to go when the time is right. And I'd say that actually some of the legwork for that, I know privately, is being laid by some of the sort of senior bureaucrats in the Treasury Department. So that's sort of a lower risk set of issues. Macroeconomic, financial coordination might be a place to start, but it's never going to be this huge thing, and it's not going to happen soon because China is not really answering the phone right now. They don't really want that engagement, apparently. Starting to answer a little bit now. So I think there's more prospect in the next couple of months. You might have either a Blinken or a Yellen visit, but we're not quite there yet. And among other things, Secretary Yellen is somewhat busy with other problems right now.
Right. Charlie, I see one question in the chat.
Yes, so this is from Miguel, who heads up the Institute's research on geoeconomics, and I would say has published the most in U.S. journals. I know some of his work has actually been used on Capitol Hill too. So his question is, the idea of secondary trade sanctions, there are some indications of China preparing a framework for such non-traditional use of trade sanctions. How do you see that working?
Yeah, no, there was a little bit of that in the Lithuania case where, in trying to divert some of its trade through Germany and other parts of Europe, Lithuania found that China was then trying to threaten Germany and other places with secondary sanctions of some kind, and so that is obviously the U.S. has used secondary sanctions, is using them today. And so China is learning from that. It's again, not that example. Lithuania was not based on a formal legal basis. China is creating a lot of the laws that would support these kinds of policies. They've created, sort of an export control oriented law of investment screening, which are kind of some of the really the two pillars probably, as well as sanctions of our technology control policies. And so they're creating these legal bases. To be honest, there is, at least here, some skepticism about whether that's just to give the show of having kind of a Potemkin village or something, where there's a sort of a show of a set of legal mechanisms, but really China's still going to apply them in informal, kind of deniable ways. But then they can say, yeah, but look, it's based on law. We're monitoring that. It is an interesting development. And, by the way, just that leads me to think about one other point, which is, in our report, we looked at these historical cases, some of them still ongoing, but and we found this pretty clear pattern of low level, sort of deniable, informal sanctions. I mean, it's possible, and there is some emerging evidence that China is changing a little bit its behavior. Just in the last day or two, you've heard about one of the big American semiconductor companies, Micron, being, sort of excluded from the market there. There's some thought that is a retaliatory measure against our semiconductor export controls. There's debate about that. Some people think that was just part of China's ongoing attempt to indigenize its innovation capability. But, there's probably a retaliatory measure. That's a higher cost strategy than we've seen in other cases. And they're going after some American companies, Bain Consulting Company and so forth. They're threatening, or there's sort of concern that China is going to do more in the Taiwan context to put real economic pressure on Taiwan. So far, that isn't highly visible. And the bottom line is, because Beijing has traditionally shown a very great aversion to paying a cost itself. It doesn't want to pay a high cost. And we're more willing to pay a cost, even though Americans may not know the cost we're paying for some of our sanctions and other policies. Businesses do. But in China, I think there's a much more delicate political economy calculation they have to make about imposing these costs. They're still a developing country. Their growth is slowing. I think they're worried about that. So the reason I'm raising this is traditionally that has been their approach. If they change that and were willing to pay more of a cost, that would be significant and could very much change even our recommended approach. It may require a more forceful response from us. But I'm not wishing that, or yet seeing hard evidence of it. But that's something we're watching.
Okay, great. Thank you for such in-depth answers. I actually have a next question also from Mikhail. During the Cold War, Western allies coordinated export controls to make them more effective. Any prospect of such coordination? You also mentioned on semiconductors, this already started to shape up. What's your assessment of how the semiconductor thing is going? And what about broader coordination of export controls? How and where would that best be set up? And I might add also, not just China, but Russia is an obvious one.
Yeah,
so to circumvent some Western sanctions.
Yes. So as Mikhail indicates, during the Cold War, we established this COCOM, coordinating committee to deal with dual-use technology exports, and a number of other mechanisms. And then, in export controls, more recently, in that period created something called, or just I guess after the Cold War, created something called the Wassenaar Arrangement to coordinate technology controls. The general view is that here that Wassenaar, and not just here, I think in Europe as well, that Wassenaar is not fit for purpose now vis-a-vis China, at least. For one thing, because Russia's a member of Wassenaar, so that makes it difficult in practical terms. It's a consensus-based organization, so difficult to move forward. It's also kind of slow. It only develops lists of controlled technologies once a year, or even every 2 years. And so that's way too slow for some of the emerging technologies that we're concerned about. So there is a lot of talk about reform of Wassenaar and a more nimble, plurilateral, non-Russia involved, non-China involving gathering of countries that are in relevant areas, or a series of such groupings. So there's already a grouping of the semiconductor countries of interest, which is basically U.S., Japan, South Korea, Netherlands, Germany, and a few others. But those are the key players in the semiconductor supply chains. And so, they're one idea is to sort of set up a plurilateral mechanism with those countries, and then on other technologies to have different groupings. There's a lot of discussion that we're actually doing a project. One of my colleagues is working on something on that very topic. So I think something is going to emerge. I would say the G7 statement that you mentioned in the introduction, Deborah, this new platform for coordination on coercion, is another example of an attempt to establish a kind of plurilateral, like-minded grouping to deal in that case with coercion, but it could deal with other issues. As for the semiconductor issue itself, so as everyone knows, maybe you don't know, but in Washington, there are 2 dates in 2022 that are considered historically significant. One is February 24th, which you're very familiar with, and the other is October 7th, which is when the U.S. imposed these really radical, I'd say, controls on advanced semiconductors and machine tools to produce them, and the components to support them, and the people to support them. So really radical in terms of, or extensive, and radical in the sense that, and very explicit by Jake Sullivan when he announced, or he gave a speech right after that in October last year, in which he said, we've changed our approach. We used to say, that as we went up the ladder, he didn't use the metaphor of a ladder, but that's how I think of it. As we went up the ladder, we would allow China and other adversaries to sort of follow, but now we're not going to. We're gonna try to maintain as much of a lead as possible, and even in a sense, kick China off the ladder for particular technologies. And that was a pretty big change. The focus since then, the U.S. did that unilaterally, which is costly for us. If Japan and the Netherlands and others circumvented those controls. So the effort after that was to try to get Japan and the Netherlands on side, which ultimately has happened. South Korea is still an issue because they've got production in China using some of those machines, though they're not producing the really high-end stuff in China. So there's still work on that front. But everybody here in Washington is waiting for a few things. First of all, is there going to be a further expansion of the semiconductor controls in some way? Secondly, are these kinds of controls going to be extended to other technologies? And the ones you consistently hear are quantum computing, biotechnology, AI, other AI-related technologies beyond semiconductors, and then to some extent, batteries and other clean energy technologies, although those people are sort of questioning whether those fall in the same category of national security or about something else. So the other thing we're all waiting for, which hasn't come up yet, is this outbound investment screening mechanism. It's relevant here. In the CHIPS Act last year, there was a prohibition on companies receiving semiconductor subsidies under the CHIPS Act. to invest in China. And there is now talk about a broader policy, which would not be a legislative solution because that's been tried and hasn't worked, but an executive order from the White House, from the president, saying that companies who wish to invest in certain technologies in certain places, and I think it's now been narrowed down to really China, that there would be some kind of process for screening or blocking that investment. That executive order has not appeared yet. I think I'm now up to something like 9 months since I've been answering the question of when is that executive order coming by saying soon, but it's been 9 months and it hasn't come. So we're all expecting it soon, but we haven't seen it. And that probably reflects a pretty vigorous debate here about whether this is a wise thing to do. Certainly, there's been pushback about the notion of a broad, CFIUS-like investment screening process where every investment into China would be reviewed in some way. That would be very burdensome. So I think that's been sort of squeezed out of this debate. But there's still talk about, gathering information on planned investments in certain areas and possibly blocking additional types of investment. One other final thing, because this is all interrelated, I think, and important stuff. There's a difference between semiconductors and all those other technologies, because in semiconductors, the United States has sort of choke points all along the supply chain because we're involved in designing most semiconductors on some level and components and other things. There's a lot of U.S. intellectual property, and so we have more ability to sort of choke the supply chain. It's not true in biotechnology or quantum. There are lots of people, doing that. The U.S. doesn't have a particular advantage, and certainly in some clean technologies, China is the big leader that has the leverage and the ability to control those supply chains. So those other technologies are more complicated to control here. So I think that's part of the delay in additional announcements on these issues, because people are trying to figure out how to effectively control those things. So
I wanted to jump in here.
Right.
Oh, go ahead, Charlie. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, Deborah, please continue, because I'm aware of the time restriction. So go ahead.
Well, that's right. It's going to beep at us. Just a quick question, Matt, to wrap up, which is one tool that the administration is not using is engaging in trade negotiations, sort of abandoning that, whereas others and many of our allies are pursuing in order to be at the table and establish rules. Why do you think the administration is not using that tool?
Well, I have a very strong opinion on this, based on analysis of U.S. interests. I think this is the biggest failing of this and the previous administration, is that they are not interested in pursuing traditional trade negotiations. I think that's a huge gap in our toolkit of responding to all these things, including coercion, but also in presenting, an alternative to China's offerings around the world, to embed us strategically, especially in the Indo-Pacific region. Again, I was just in Korea and I was in Singapore a few weeks before that. And, not surprisingly, you hear a lot about those partners wanting the United States to be engaged in that region, not just as a military and security partner, but also as an economic partner doing real trade deals. What people want from the United States is, our fat, happy consumers like me who buy lots of stuff from around the world. That's our real leverage and power in this economic realm. And we're not offering that in these various types of negotiations that we're doing, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework and others. And I think that's a big strategic mistake and failing, and we need to get back into traditional trade agreements. But it's clear from Jake Sullivan's speech at the end of April, he's very clear in a way that I think is analytically wrong, but he's very clear that he said, this Bretton Woods order and, implicating the WTO and other institutions like the IMF and World Bank, that was good for a while, but it's broken and it's no longer relevant to today's global economy. I'm slightly oversimplifying. I just think that's bad and wrong analysis. It's definitely broken, but fixable and needs to be fixed. And we need to, as the United States, we need to say we're working on reform and fixing it. Our partners are very unhappy, understandably. And he also said, we're not going to do traditional trade. Although he, again, described traditional trade as tariff cuts and things, which has not been central to U.S. trade policy for 30 years, but he mischaracterized that as the thing we're not going to do anymore. So it's unfortunate. I think it is an arrow in our quiver that is not being fired, and that's to our huge strategic detriment around the world, in my humble opinion.
Well, thank you. I knew you held some strong opinions on this, and it's true, the U.S. is not at the table. So, yeah. Well, Matt, thank you so much. This has been extraordinarily educational for many. I had to do a little extra homework to prepare. But
I hope you didn't read all of the footnotes. There are, I think, 700 footnotes or something in our report, but
90% of the report, but not all the footnotes. No, okay. But thank you and to your team for having done that, because without that factual analysis of what we're dealing with in terms of the challenge that that China and Russia, by the way, poses to the economic order. But so thank you, and thanks to the FIIA team, and I'll turn it over to Charlie.
Well, really, I was just going to say thank you both, Matthew and Deborah, for really going in depth. I can't believe how much kind of territory we covered, as it were, metaphorically, but also in great depth. This is exactly what we hope that the transatlantic current events can bring, and have a chance to listen to experts across the Atlantic and understand perspectives better from Washington. So thank you very much for that. Thank you also for the questions, and look forward in and with this, just unfortunately, because I could have continued this, the webinar is closed.
Thank you very much, Charlie. Thanks, Deborah. Please come and visit us at CSIS, and look forward to seeing you in Helsinki someday. Thank you so much.
That'd be great.
Do that. Great.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.